Imagine being 34 years old. You are sitting at the absolute pinnacle of your world.
Right, just completely at the top.
Exactly. You've been appointed to a position that is, essentially the equivalent of being the president of Harvard, Oxford, and MIT combined.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You have unimaginable wealth. You have the ear of the government. And when you walk down the street, you have this entourage of literally hundreds of students taking notes on everything you say.
You're the ultimate authority.
You really are. And then one day you walk into your grand lecture hall, you open your mouth to speak to the brightest minds of your generation, and your vocal cords freeze.
They just stop working.
Totally freeze. You try to push the words out, but you physically cannot speak. It's like your body has just decided that everything you've built your entire life on is a complete lie.
It is a terrifying image, honestly. And the illness didn't just stop at his voice. He couldn't eat. His digestion shut down completely. Yeah, physicians were brought in from all over the empire, and they eventually just threw up their hands. They realized this wasn't a pathogen or physical trauma.
It was something else entirely.
Exactly. This was a man whose internal reality had violently collided with his external life.
Which is exactly why we're here today. Because today's deep dive is into the life and mind of a historical genius who experienced, really, the ultimate existential crisis.
And he used it to change everything.
He used that complete psychological breakdown to revolutionize human thought. So, we are exploring the mind of Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali, who lived from 1058 to 1111.
A really pivotal time.
Extremely. And we're pulling all of this from an incredibly comprehensive source text, A History of Muslim Philosophy.
It's a fantastic resource for this.
It really is. So our mission today is to figure out how this single 11th century scholar managed to be, a theologian, a philosopher, a skeptic, and a mystic all at once.
Quite the resume.
Right. We're going to use this text as our map to decode how Ghazali synthesized ideas that predate modern Western thinkers like Descartes, Hume, and Kant by literally centuries.
And, it is crucial to state right at the top that as we navigate these incredibly dense philosophical and theological arguments, we are acting strictly as your guides.
Absolutely. We're just the messengers here.
Right, because these debates have shaped history, and they involve deeply held religious tenets. So we are not here to take sides or endorse a particular theology.
No, not at all.
Our goal is to impartially examine the mechanics of how this brilliant mind dismantled and rebuilt the intellectual world around him.
And to really grasp the mechanics of that mind, we have to look at the environment that forged him, right? So Al-Ghazali was born in 1058 in Tuzis, which is in modern-day Iran.
Yeah, his early life has all the makings of a classic origin story.
It really does. He's orphaned early, he gets raised by a Sufi friend of his father, and Sufism, just to clarify, being the mystical, deeply inward-focused branch of Islam.
Right, very contemplative.
But Ghazali isn't just, a quiet, contemplative kid. He is a brilliant, aggressive intellect, just a genuine child prodigy.
Oh, he was a voracious consumer of knowledge. He moved through the educational ranks at lightning speed.
He just absorbed everything.
He really did. He eventually studied under the most famous theologian of the era, Al-Juwayni, and his brilliance caught the eye of the Seljuk vizier, Nizam al-Mulk.
And this vizier was a big deal.
A massive deal. Arguably the most powerful man in the Islamic world at the time. And he was building this network of huge state-sponsored universities called the Nizamiya.
Which brings us to that moment of total success we talked about. At just 34, Nizam al-Mulk appoints Ghazali to the chair of theology at the flagship Nizamiya Academy in Baghdad.
Which, that cannot be overstated in its importance. Baghdad was the intellectual center of the world then.
Right, it was the place to be.
Absolutely. And Ghazali wasn't just an academic. He was a state asset. He was the most eminent theologian of his day.
So he was consulting on the big stuff.
Oh, yeah. Massive legal disputes, political strategy, religious doctrine. He had achieved total, unmitigated worldly success.
But then in 1095, at the absolute peak of that career, he just breaks.
He hits the wall.
He hits it hard. That vocal cord paralysis we talked about, his appetite just vanishes. He falls into this severe depression.
It's a complete shutdown.
Right. And when he finally diagnoses his own problem, he realizes that his entire intellectual pursuit up to that point was driven by, a desire for fame, wealth, and self-glorification.
Which is a tough pill to swallow.
Very tough. And even worse, he realizes that his theological teachings, the very things he is famous for, They lacked true, undeniable intellectual certainty.
It's a profound psychosomatic manifestation of an epistemological crisis.
Epistemological meaning.
Right, epistemology being the study of how we know what we know.
Got it.
And if you look at the trajectory of his life, it makes perfect sense why this happened. Remember, he was raised with early exposure to Sufism.
Which is all about that internal experience.
Exactly. It emphasizes a direct, personal, almost visceral experience of the divine. But his day job in Baghdad...
Right, the day job is totally different.
His day job was being a dogmatic theologian. He was spinning these incredibly complex webs of casuistry and scholastic logic.
So he was teaching thousands of students what to believe based purely on authority and tradition, not on direct experience or, like, unshakable proof.
Exactly.
So the vocal cords were literally the instrument of his hypocrisy.
That's a great way to put it.
He's standing there, projecting absolute certainty to the world, while internally he's terrified that he doesn't actually know if any of it is true.
His body just rebelled against the cognitive dissonance. I mean, he could not physically force himself to teach what he no longer intellectually trusted.
And his reaction to this wasn't just, to take a sabbatical or go to a spa for a few weeks.
No, not at all.
He executes what might be the most dramatic career pivot in history. He essentially acts like a modern Fortune 500 CEO who transfers his entire multi-million-dollar portfolio to a trust, leaves his corner office, and just disappears into the woods to live off the grid.
It's radical.
It's wildly radical.
Yeah.
Ghazali gave away his immense wealth. He abandoned his prestigious position. He made sure his family was provided for with a trust, of course, and then he just left Baghdad.
Just walked away.
Yeah, he spent the next 11 years as a wandering dervish, a mystic, basically traveling in relative obscurity through Damascus, Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina.
Which tells us this wasn't just severe burnout.
Right, because burnout just requires rest.
Exactly. An epistemological crisis requires a total deconstruction of reality. He had to figure out how to cure his own mind.
And to cure his mind, he had to answer a terrifying question.
Yeah.
One that, I think any listener who has ever stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m. can totally relate to.
We've all been there.
Oh, yeah. And the question is, how do I actually know that anything I believe is true?
But it's the ultimate question.
He documented this entire process in his autobiography, The Deliverer from Error. And the method he outlines is wild because he is anticipating René Descartes' method of radical doubt, but he's doing it like over 500 years earlier.
It is a striking historical parallel, honestly.
It really is.
Descartes is famous for his method of doubting absolutely everything until he found a certainty he couldn't doubt, which, led to his famous, "I think, therefore I am."
Right.
Well, Ghazali did exactly this in the 11th century. He decided he needed to reconstruct his knowledge from the ground up, seeking a truth that carried its own undeniable evidence.
So step one of this deconstruction. He attacks authority and tradition, which he called tacklet.
Tacklet, yes.
He basically looks around and makes this very sociological observation. He says, wait a minute. Jewish children grow up to be Jews. Christian children grow up to be Christians. Muslim children grow up to be Muslims.
It's a brilliant observation for the time.
Yeah. He says, if your foundational beliefs are just an accident of your geography and who your parents are, then mere inherited belief cannot possibly be absolute truth.
It's a remarkably modern perspective. Once he strips away everything society taught him, he is left with himself. So he turns to his own senses. Can he trust what he physically sees and hears?
And he quickly realizes, no, the eyes are completely lying to us all the time.
All the time.
He uses a couple of brilliant examples. He looks at a shadow cast by a sundial. If you look at a shadow, it appears perfectly, completely still.
Yeah, right. It doesn't look like it's moving.
But if you wait an hour, the shadow is moved. So the eye perceives stillness where there was actually constant motion.
A great example.
And then he looks at a star in the night sky. To the human eye, a star looks like it's, the size of a coin.
Sure.
But geometric and astronomical calculations prove that the star is actually larger than the entire Earth.
Therefore, the senses deceive reason.
Exactly.
The sensory data coming into his brain is fundamentally flawed. So Ghazali posits that if the senses are unreliable, perhaps the only thing a human being can truly trust are the necessary principles of reason itself.
Like math.
Right. Mathematics, formal logic, the fundamental laws of thought.
Like the idea that 10 is always greater than 3, or the law of non-contradiction, a thing cannot both exist and not exist at the exact same time. These feel unshakable.
They do feel unshakable.
But this is where Ghazali takes a left turn that feels straight out of the Matrix or like the modern simulation hypothesis. He actually doubts that too.
He goes all the way.
He wonders if the fundamental rules of math and logic might also be a complete illusion.
It is a fascinating and honestly terrifying thought experiment.
It really is.
Ghazali points out that when you are asleep and dreaming, you believe the events in the dream are perfectly real and entirely logical.
Right, it makes total sense while you're in it.
Exactly. Within the context of the dream, the rules make sense. But the moment you wake up, you realize that your dream logic was actually just fantasy.
It falls apart instantly.
It does. So Ghazali asks, what if our waking life, this reality where 10 is greater than 3, is just another kind of dream compared to the afterlife, or some higher state of consciousness?
He's suggesting there might be a higher faculty, something way above reason, that will one day wake us up and show us that our rational mathematical truths were just, well, illusions of our current state.
Exactly. He is questioning the very instrument of human cognition.
Okay, doubting my eyes makes total sense. Optical illusions happen all the time. But I struggle with doubting that 10 is more than 3.
It's a leap.
It is. Because if you break the fundamental rules of math and logic, how do you keep from just falling into total paralyzing nihilism? Like, how do you function if you don't even believe in basic addition?
Well, you don't function, and Ghazali admits this. For about 2 months, he was trapped in this void.
Wow. 2 months of just nothing.
He was essentially a complete, absolute skeptic. It was the darkest period of his crisis. I mean, he couldn't rely on society, his senses, or his own mind.
It sounds agonizing.
But eventually, he experienced a profound internal shift, what he described as a light cast into his breast by God.
So he finds a way out.
He does, but he didn't abandon reason because it was useless. He realized he had to abandon reason as the ultimate arbiter of absolute truth.
Ah, I see. He recognized that reason is a powerful, necessary tool, but it has a ceiling.
Precisely. Reason can organize the physical world, but it cannot grasp the transcendent.
Makes sense.
So, having rebuilt his foundational understanding of what it means to know something, he looked around at the intellectual landscape of his time.
He's ready to engage again.
Right. And he categorized the truth seekers into 4 main groups: theologians, mystics, authoritarians, sometimes called Thelemites, and philosophers.
Okay.
And having just deconstructed the limits of his own rational mind, he decided to turn his sights on the group that worshipped reason above all else.
The philosophers.
The philosophers.
Which sets the stage for one of the greatest intellectual takedowns in history. Before he attacked the reigning philosophical heavyweights, and we're talking about giants here, like Aristotle, and the brilliant Muslim philosophers Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, who's known in the West as Avicenna.
Heavyweights is right.
Yeah. But before he attacks them, Ghazali did something that requires just a terrifying amount of discipline. He didn't just criticize them from the outside using theological talking points.
No, that would be too easy.
Exactly. He spent years mastering their systems perfectly.
It is the ultimate display of intellectual integrity. Ghazali firmly believed that to refute a complex system, you cannot attack a straw man.
You can't just skim the Wikipedia page.
Exactly. You must inhabit that system so completely, understand its internal logic so thoroughly that you equal or surpass its greatest living exponents. Only then can you find the structural flaws.
I love this so much. It's like stealing the enemy's blueprints, studying them for years, just to find the thermal exhaust port on the Death Star.
That's a perfect analogy.
He actually wrote a book called The Intentions of the Philosophers, Maqasid al-Falasifa, which was simply a summary of their views. But his summary was so brilliant, so perfectly articulated, that it created this massive historical irony.
Yes. Oh, this is one of my favorite historical details.
It's so good.
When that book was eventually translated into Latin and made its way to Europe a century later, Christian scholars like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas read it and mistakenly thought Ghazali was a devoted Aristotelian philosopher.
They completely missed the point.
They thought he was the ultimate champion of the very system he was about to destroy. They didn't realize it was just the setup.
He was literally just clearing his throat. Because shortly after he drops the hammer, he publishes a book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, which translates to The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
That's a great title.
So good. And it is a devastating surgical critique. He doesn't just yell at them, he dissects them. He starts by dividing the philosophers into 3 camps: materialists, naturalists or deists, and theists.
Right. And he essentially dismisses the materialists and naturalists quite easily.
Why is that?
Because they deny a creator entirely, which puts them outside the scope of his main theological project. He focuses his massive intellect entirely on the theists.
Okay, the ones who believe in God.
Specifically, the followers of Aristotle and the Neoplatonist Plotinus. These were the philosophers who claimed to believe in God, but had constructed highly complex logical systems to explain how God operated.
And he charges them with infidelity on 3 specific points. He lists 20 total errors in their philosophy, but 3 of them he flags as straight-up unforgivable heresy that takes them completely outside of Islam.
The big 3.
Right. 1, their belief in the eternity of the world. 2, their claim that God lacks knowledge of particulars.
Okay.
And 3, their denial of bodily resurrection. But looking at the source text, I'm struck by something really interesting.
What's that?
He is laser-focused on destroying their metaphysics, but he totally accepts their math, their astronomy, and their formal logic. Why is that? What made their metaphysics so dangerous while their math was perfectly fine?
That distinction is exactly why Ghazali is so important. He was highly scientific in his approach. He argued forcefully that theology has absolutely no quarrel with mathematics, astronomy, or formal logic.
Okay, because they're proven.
Yes, because those disciplines are based on demonstrable, verifiable proofs. If an astronomer uses math to predict a solar eclipse on a Tuesday, Ghazali says you must believe them. It is foolish for a religious person to argue with a mathematical proof.
You can't argue with math.
Exactly. But metaphysics, the study of the ultimate nature of reality, the origin of the universe, the mind of God, that is different. Ghazali argued that the philosophers were smuggling unproven assumptions into their metaphysics.
I see.
They were taking guesses about the nature of God, dressing those guesses up in the language of formal logic, and pretending their metaphysical theories had the same absolute certainty as an algebraic equation.
So he was calling them out for intellectual overreach.
Exactly. And in doing so, they were contradicting the explicit teachings of religious revelation based on nothing more than philosophical arrogance.
So let's look at how he dismantled their biggest assumption, which brings us to the first massive charge of heresy, the origin of the universe itself, the battle over time in creation.
The philosophers, heavily influenced by Aristotle, argued that the world is co-eternal with God.
Co-eternal meaning it's always been there, just like God.
Right. They were fundamentally uncomfortable with the concept of creatio ex nihilo, the idea that a universe could just pop into existence out of absolute yawning nothingness.
Because Aristotle believed that matter always existed in some form.
Yes. The philosophers claimed that God constantly acts upon the universe, turning potential matter into actual matter from all eternity.
Okay.
They argued that if God created the world at a specific finite moment in time, let's say, a random Tuesday 10 billion years ago, then a very problematic logical consequence arises.
Oh, I think I see where you're going with this. If God is sitting around for all eternity and then suddenly decides to create the universe on a Tuesday, something must have prompted him to act.
Exactly.
Something must have caused God to change his mind at that exact moment. But God is supposed to be perfect and changeless. A perfect being doesn't suddenly get a new idea or change its mind. Therefore, to protect God's perfection, the universe must have always been flowing out of him continuously.
You've perfectly articulated the philosopher's dilemma. It is deeply rooted in the idea of sufficient reason. There must be a reason why God chose that exact moment and not the moment before.
Right.
But Ghazali completely rejected this. He argued fiercely for creatio ex nihilo. He stated that God created matter, he created form, and this is the truly mind-bending part. He created time itself at a finite point in the past.
Wow. This sounds remarkably like the modern debate over the Big Bang in astrophysics.
It really does.
When people learn about the Big Bang, the most common question is, well, what was there before the Big Bang? And physicists have to patiently explain that time itself was created in the singularity of the Big Bang, so the word before is literally meaningless.
There was no before.
Exactly. There's no time for there to be a bit before. Ghazali is arguing the exact same concept in the 11th century.
He absolutely is. He recognized that asking what God was doing before he created time is a nonsensical question because it subjects God to the very temporal limits he created.
That is just brilliant.
It is. And if we connect this to the broader history of Western philosophy, Ghazali's argument beautifully anticipates Immanuel Kant's first antinomy hundreds of years later.
Oh, interesting. How so? Break down Kant's antinomy for us and how it relates to Ghazali.
Well, Kant argued that if you assume the world has no beginning in time, if it is infinite in the past, you run into an impossible logical contradiction.
Okay, lay it on me.
If the past is infinite, That means an infinite series of events must have elapsed, must have been completed, to arrive at the present moment. But by definition, an infinite series can never be completed.
Because it's infinite.
Right. Therefore, you can never arrive at now. Since we are obviously experiencing now, time cannot stretch back infinitely. It must have had a finite beginning.
That makes my head spin, but it's brilliant logic.
Mm.
So Ghazali exposed that the philosophers were assuming every effect needs an external cause in time, and he proved that was just an assumption, not a logical rule.
Right. But the philosophers did push back.
Naturally.
They argued that all moments of empty time are identical. Time is just a flat sequence of identical moments. So even if God created time, why would God pick one specific moment to instantiate the universe rather than another? There is nothing distinguishing moment A from moment B.
Wait, hold on. Their logic actually makes sense to me.
It's a strong argument.
It is. If I am staring at two completely identical cups of coffee, there is no rational reason for me to pick the left one over the right one. I need a determining factor.
Exactly.
And Ghazali's answer to the text is that God's choice is just arbitrary, that his will is undetermined and can just randomly pick a moment. I'm not going to lie, that feels like a bit of a cop-out.
It does sound like one at first.
Yeah, does Ghazali have a deeper defense for this, or is he just yelling because God said so?
It only feels like a cop-out if we constrain God with human psychology. Ghazali's defense here is actually quite profound. He is defining the ultimate nature of true, unadulterated free will.
True free will.
Yes. For Ghazali, the very definition of a truly free will is the ability to choose between two completely identical alternatives without needing an external determining factor.
Okay, unpack that. Why is needing a reason a bad thing for God?
Because if God needed a reason outside of himself to choose a specific moment, if there was some law of nature or logic that forced God to choose moment A instead of moment B, then that outside reason would be dictating to God.
Oh, it would be the boss of God.
Exactly. It would make God subordinate to an external rule. By insisting that God's choice is arbitrary, that it requires no external justification, Ghazali is fiercely protecting God's absolute omnipotence and total freedom. He is saying God acts simply because he wills to act. Full stop.
Okay, that significantly shifts my perspective. It's not a cop-out, it's a firewall. He is protecting the idea of an active, willing, deeply personal creator.
Because the philosophers were terrified of giving God a will.
And to avoid it, they constructed this incredibly complex, bizarre system to explain how God created the world without actually choosing to create it. Let's look at how Ghazali tears that system down.
We are talking about the theory of emanation.
Emanation, right.
The philosophers, specifically following the Neoplatonist Plotinus, had backed themselves into a massive philosophical corner. They believed God was perfectly unified, absolutely simple, the one.
But the universe we live in is messy, highly complex, and full of multiplicity. We have trees, planets, humans, emotions, bacteria. How does a perfectly simple, singular one create a messy, diverse many?
That was the problem. The foundational rule of their metaphysics was a strict logical axiom. From one, only one can proceed. A purely simple cause can only produce a purely simple effect.
So they imagined a cosmic hierarchy, a staircase, right? God doesn't create the dirt and the trees and the humans directly, because that would involve God with multiplicity. Instead, God passively radiates or emanates a first intelligence.
Think of it like light radiating from the sun. The sun doesn't choose to shine. The light just naturally emanates from its nature.
Right, but this first intelligence is slightly less perfect than God. And because it is less perfect, it has different aspects. It knows God, it knows itself, and it knows that its own existence is possible.
Notice how multiplicity has just entered the picture.
Yeah, we've got three things now.
The first intelligence has three different aspects of knowledge. And from these three aspects, it emanates three new things. A second intelligence, the soul of the highest celestial sphere, and the physical body of that celestial sphere.
I always compare this theory of emanation to a bloated, highly inefficient corporate bureaucracy.
It really is.
You have the ultimate CEO, God, who sits in the pristine corner office and is far too perfect to ever deal with the messy factory floor. So the CEO only talks to the VP.
The VP being the first intelligence.
Exactly. The VP talks to the director. The director talks to the manager, and so on. all the way down through 10 levels of middle management, the 10 intelligences, until you finally reach the 10th one, which they call the active intellect.
Right, the guy at the bottom.
Yeah, and that 10th manager is the one who finally does the dirty work of creating the material world and human souls.
That is a highly effective analogy for their cosmology. It was a massive org chart of the universe. And Ghazali looked at this incredibly convoluted cosmic bureaucracy and basically laughed.
He wasn't impressed.
Not at all. He called it arbitrary, idle speculation, and mythical nonsense. But he didn't just mock it, though. He attacked her foundational rule. From one, only one can proceed. He found a fatal, unrecoverable flaw in their internal logic.
Okay, walk us through the flaw. How did he break the staircase?
Ghazali forces them to look at the first intelligence. The philosophers claim this first intelligence emanates directly from God, who is purely one. But then they readily admit that the first intelligence is composite. It has three different aspects of knowledge, as we just discussed.
Right.
Ghazali essentially says, wait a minute, stop right there. If the first intelligence is composite, where did that multiplicity come from?
Well, it had to come from its source. It had to come from God.
Exactly. If it only came from God and it has multiplicity, then multiplicity can proceed from the one.
Oh, wow. Game over.
And if multiplicity can come directly from God, then your entire foundational rule is broken. The CEO doesn't need the 9 layers of middle management.
God can just do it himself.
Right. If God can emanate a first intelligence with 3 aspects, God can just as easily create the diverse material world directly. Ghazali forces them into a logical corner where their own premises destroy their conclusion.
He used their own sword against them. But it wasn't just a logical game for him. Ghazali calls this emanationist philosophy darkness piled upon darkness. It feels deeply personal. Why was he so angry about it? Did he believe this convoluted system actively harmed how an everyday person related to religion?
Absolutely. Think about what this bureaucratic system does to the human soul. The philosophers were terrified of giving God a will because, in their view, willing implies a desire.
And a desire implies a lack.
Right, you only want something if you don't already have it, and God cannot lack anything. So they made God into a passive, unthinking, unfeeling battery that just eternally radiates energy downward.
That's pretty bleak.
A God who doesn't actively will anything, a God who is 10 levels of management away from you, is a God you cannot pray to.
Because you can't have a relationship with the battery.
Precisely. It entirely severs the personal, intimate relationship between the human and the divine that is the core of religious experience.
Which leads directly to Ghazali's next major grievance against the philosophers, and arguably the most emotionally charged one of all. It tackles the fundamental question: does God even know you exist?
We are diving into the debate over God's omniscience here.
Right.
The philosopher Ibn Sina argued that God is indeed omniscient, but with a massive, highly problematic asterisk. Because God is changeless, eternal, and completely outside of time, Ibn Sina argued that God cannot have moment-to-moment perceptual knowledge of the world.
Wait, if I'm understanding Ibn Sina, his logic does seem to track.
It does track, rationally.
If I sit on a park bench and watch a red car drive past me, my visual field is changing. My brain state is actively changing from moment to moment. I am experiencing a sequence of changes in order to perceive the car moving.
Right. And since God, by definition, cannot change, God cannot watch the car drive by. Ibn Sina argued that God knows all the particulars of the universe, but only in what he called a universal way.
Meaning what, exactly?
God knows the mathematical laws of the universe, the general concepts, the species, the eternal patterns. Aristotle famously described God as thought thinking itself. God only contemplates eternal perfections, not the messy, changing details of human history.
So, in Ibn Sina's view, God is like a master algorithm at a social media company.
That's an interesting way to put it.
Think about it. The algorithm knows your demographic data perfectly. It knows you are a 35-year-old living in Chicago who buys running shoes and drinks oat milk. It has a flawless, universal profile of your patterns.
Okay, I'm with you.
But the algorithm doesn't know that you're sitting on your couch crying right now. It doesn't know your immediate moment-to-moment pain.
That captures the emotional disconnect perfectly. And Ghazali found this concept absolutely horrifying. He viewed it as a complete betrayal of the Quran and the very foundation of faith.
You want a personal God.
He insisted that God's knowledge is not abstract or algorithmic. It is intimately, infinitely specific. He famously quoted that God knows the creeping of the black ant upon the rugged rock in a dark night.
That's a beautiful image. But I want to pause here, because the philosophical tension is so rich. I have to admit, Ibn Sina's logic makes perfect sense to me.
It's hard to refute.
It is. If God knows it is raining right now, and then an hour later, God knows it has stopped raining, hasn't God's internal state of knowledge changed? And if God's knowledge changes, God changes. How on earth did Ghazali counter that logic without compromising God's eternal nature?
It is the ultimate philosophical tension between an eternal, changeless God and the ever-fleeting now of human experience. Ghazali attacks Ibn Sina's logic by breaking down the nature of change.
Okay.
He argues that the philosophers are conflating a change in the object of knowledge with a change in the essence of the knower.
How does he separate those two things?
He points out a glaring inconsistency in Ibn Sina's own system. The philosophers claim God's knowledge doesn't change, yet they readily admit that the objects of his knowledge, the universe, the planets, the seasons, are constantly changing. Ghazali asks, how can the object of cognition change while the subject's knowledge remains entirely unitary? Furthermore, he argues that knowing a relational change does not change the essence of the knower.
Give me an example of a relational change, just so I can picture it.
Sure. Imagine you are standing to the left of a tree. Then you walk to the right of the tree. Your relationship to the tree has changed. But the tree itself hasn't changed its essence. It hasn't grown new branches or changed color simply because you moved.
That makes perfect sense.
Ghazali argues that God eternally knows all events, past, present, and future, in a single, unified act of knowing. When an event transitions from being future to being past in our human timeline, that is a relational change. It doesn't alter the eternal, unchanging essence of God's mind.
So he knows it all at once, forever.
Yes. Ghazali ultimately argues that the philosopher's desperate attempt to protect God's unity actually reduces God to a dead, passive mirror. A God who only knows universal concepts, cannot hear a prayer, cannot intervene in history, and cannot care about human suffering.
This is a radical reassertion of God's active presence in every single detail of reality. And if God is actively involved in the smallest details of history, it completely changes how we view the physical universe.
It absolutely does.
Which brings us to what might be Ghazali's most famous and most controversial philosophical innovation, the illusion of cause and effect.
This is where Ghazali's brilliance shines brightest and where he makes a leap that reverberates through the centuries. He anticipates the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume by about 600 years.
Wow.
Ghazali makes a startling claim. He argues that there is absolutely no logical necessity connecting a cause and an effect in the natural world.
That is massive. So if I take a piece of cotton and I hold it over a roaring fire and the cotton bursts into flames and burns, Ghazali is saying the fire didn't cause the burning.
That is exactly what he's saying. It sounds absurd to our modern, scientifically trained ears, but follow his logic. He says, we observe the fire and we observe the burning of the cotton, but all we actually see is conjunction, two events happening next to each other in time and space.
We don't see the actual connection.
We do not actually see a hidden connection. The fire is an inanimate object. It has no brain, no will, no agency, no internal power to burn.
Okay, my brain is short-circuiting a bit here.
Ah.
If the inanimate fire doesn't physically burn the cotton, what does?
God does.
Directly.
Every single time. In every single moment. This is a profound metaphysical worldview known as theistic occasionalism.
Occasionalism.
Right. Ghazali argues that the connection we repeatedly see between fire and burning, or between drinking water and our thirst being quenched, is purely a psychological habit. It is a norm or a pattern impressed upon our human minds because God typically chooses to act in a consistent, predictable way.
Let me try to wrap my head around this with a modern analogy. Think about playing a video game like Super Mario.
Okay, I'm with you.
When you press the A button on your controller, Mario jumps on the screen. Now, the plastic button on your controller didn't physically cause the pixels on the TV to move upwards. The button has no actual power over the screen.
Right, they are separate things.
The only reason the two events are connected is because a programmer wrote a line of code that says, when button A is pressed, execute the jump animation. The programmer is the active agent connecting the two events. For Ghazali, God is the ultimate programmer, constantly connecting the event of the fire to the event of the burning.
That is a phenomenal analogy, and it highlights exactly why Ghazali is making this argument. What can the programmer do? The programmer can change the code at any time. This worldview allows for the possibility of miracles without breaking logic.
Right. Because if fire intrinsically, logically must burn cotton, if it's a necessary law of existence, then the biblical and Quranic story of the prophet Abraham being thrown into a massive fire and surviving untouched is logically impossible.
It would be a direct contradiction.
Exactly. But if fire only burns because God actively wills it to burn in that specific microscopic moment, then a miracle isn't a violation of logic. A miracle is simply God choosing not to run the usual code for one specific moment.
God suspends his usual habit. God is the only true agent, the only real cause in the entire universe.
But wait, this raises a massive red flag for me.
Let's hear it.
If nature is just a habit, and every single moment, every falling leaf, every heartbeat, every chemical reaction is directly, arbitrarily willed by God, doesn't that make science completely impossible?
The anti-science critique.
Right. Because if there are no actual physical laws, just God's moment-to-moment choices, why should anyone bother studying medicine or astronomy? How did Ghazali reconcile this seemingly anti-science view with his own deep appreciation for mathematics and planetary motion?
It is a critical question, and it's where many people misunderstand Ghazali. What is fascinating here is that Ghazali does not deny the regularity of nature. He only denies the absolute logical necessity of it.
Okay, what's the distinction?
He says that what we call a cause is actually just the sum total of many observable conditions, none of which have an independent will.
So he can still study the patterns.
Exactly. God is faithful to the norm he established. The astronomer can still calculate and predict the solar eclipse because God's habits are incredibly consistent. Ghazali draws a sharp line between logical necessity and empirical observation.
What's the difference between those two?
Logical necessity means the opposite is impossible. For example, a triangle has 3 sides. It is logically impossible for a triangle to have 4 sides. That rule cannot be broken even by a miracle.
Right, that's just a definition.
But empirical observation, like noticing that fire always burns paper, it's just a consistent pattern we have observed. It is not a logical necessity. Therefore, science is perfectly valid. The scientific method is the study of God's habits.
That's a fascinating way to frame it.
Science just shouldn't get arrogant and mistake a highly consistent pattern for an unbreakable, eternal metaphysical law.
Wow. So with the mechanistic, bureaucratic universe of the philosophers completely dismantled, Ghazali has cleared the board. He has proved that reason has limits, that God is intimately involved, and that causality is just God's habit.
The slate is clean.
Now, he has to rebuild the world for the human being. And he rebuilt it entirely around the human soul and its direct connection to this active, willing God. Let's look at his mysticism in psychology.
Having established that God is primarily an active will, not just a passive intellect like the philosophers thought, Ghazali turns his gaze inward. His approach to mysticism was deeply sober and psychological.
Not the wild, ecstatic stuff.
Right, he sharply rejected the extreme, intoxicated claims of some of the more radical Sufis of his time.
You're talking about figures like Al-Hallaj, who famously walked around in a state of ecstasy screaming, "I am the truth," essentially implying a literal physical union where he became God.
Yes, which understandably got him executed by the Orthodox clerics.
Yeah, that didn't go over well.
Ghazali navigated a much more rigorous path. For Ghazali, the human soul, because it is created in the image of God, is also primarily a will. He essentially constructs a philosophy of volo ergo sum. I will, therefore I am.
So not just I think, therefore I am.
Exactly. He argues that the soul is not a physical, spatial thing inside the body. He categorizes it as belonging to the world of command, or emera, a spiritual dimension that sits midway between the absolute divine world and the dense material world.
The soul acts as a mirror, positioned to reflect God's attributes into the physical world. And his most famous guiding principle is that deep knowledge of the self is the only true key to knowledge of God.
It's all about introspection.
But it's not intellectual knowledge. I read this brilliant allegory he used in the text about a competition between Chinese and Greek painters.
Oh, it is one of his most powerful metaphors. It perfectly illustrates his psychological framework.
So, as the story goes, a powerful king challenges the Chinese and the Greeks to a grand painting contest in a massive royal hall. The Greeks are given one wall, the Chinese are given the opposite wall, and a heavy curtain is dropped between them so they can't see what the other's doing.
Setting the stage.
Right. The Greeks demand all these rare, vibrant pigments and spend weeks meticulously painting a complex masterpiece. But the Chinese painters don't ask for any paint at all.
No paint.
None. They just spend the entire time aggressively scrubbing, sanding, and polishing their bare wall until it is as smooth as glass. Finally, the day of the reveal arrives. The king drops the curtain.
The big reveal.
He looks at the Greek wall, and it's a beautiful painting. But then he turns around and looks at the Chinese wall. Because it is polished so perfectly, so immaculately, it reflects the Greek painting in all its glory, but with an added luminous transcendent depth that the original painting didn't even have.
It is a stunning allegory because it synthesizes his voluntarism, his pragmatism, and his idealism so elegantly. The Greek painters represent the philosophers and the dogmatic theologians.
One's adding paint.
Yes, they try to acquire knowledge through intense external study, memorizing facts, building logical arguments that are constantly adding paint to the wall of their minds.
But the Chinese painters represent the mystics, the path Ghazali ultimately chose.
Exactly. The mystics don't try to accumulate external facts. They recognize that the truth is already present. Their job is to purify their own souls of ego, distraction, and vice.
Scrubbing the wall.
Scrubbing the wall. And when the soul is completely polished, it naturally reflects the divine truth with absolute clarity. For Ghazali, true religion isn't just quiet, intellectual contemplation. It requires brutal, active moral transformation.
But I have to ask the practical question here.
Sure.
If the ultimate goal of human existence is to polish the soul so it can reflect God, how exactly does a normal person do that? We don't live in isolated caves. We are surrounded by jobs, stress, family drama, and endless temptations.
That is exactly the problem Ghazali tackles next. He didn't leave his followers with just lofty metaphors. He wrote a practical, incredibly detailed psychological handbook for human behavior. He maps out his ethics.
And this is where his background as a theologian and a deeply introspective mystic really merge. How does he handle the classic ethical dilemma of free will versus determinism?
He had to reconcile the orthodox Islamic view, specifically Asharite theology, which heavily leans toward determinism, arguing that God creates all acts, with the practical, everyday reality that humans clearly make choices.
It's a tricky balance.
Asharite theology used a concept called cause, or acquisition, saying God creates the act, but the human acquires it. Ghazali deepens this by analyzing the microscopic psychology of how a human choice actually happens. He maps out a highly specific 5-step sequence of action.
Walk us through the 5 steps.
First, there is the impression a random thought or sensory input enters the mind. Second is the inclination an automatic appetite or desire is triggered by that impression. Third is conviction. The rational mind steps in and judges if this is a good or bad idea.
Big 1, 2, 3.
Fourth is resolution. The active will makes a firm decision to proceed or abort. And fifth, finally, is the physical action itself.
Okay, let's ground this with a real-world example. Let's say I am on a strict diet trying to improve my health. I walk into the break room at work and I see a massive box of glazed donuts.
The ultimate test.
Right. Step 1, impression. The visual data of the donut enters my brain. Step 2, inclination. My mouth instantly waters, my blood sugar spikes, I intensely desire the sugar.
And Ghazali explicitly notes that you cannot control those first 2 steps. The impression and the initial biological inclination happen to you. You are a biological creature.
So no guilt yet.
Right. You are not morally culpable for simply feeling hungry when you see the donut.
The guilt hasn't entered the picture. But then step 3, conviction. My rational brain reminds me, you are on a diet. Eating that donut violates your long-term goals.
Yeah.
Step 4, resolution. I actively deploy my willpower, I clench my jaw, and I decide to walk away. Step 5, action. I literally turn my feet and leave the room.
Precisely. For Ghazali, true free will, and therefore true moral responsibility, exists exclusively in the space between the initial inclination and the final resolution.
In that tiny gap.
It is the battleground ruled by reason and will. God may create the physical movements, but the human soul is entirely responsible for the internal resolution.
It sounds remarkably like the foundational principles of modern cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT teaches patients to intercept an automatic, intrusive thought before it spirals into a negative action. Ghazali is mapping out CBT in the 11th century.
He was a master psychologist. And having mapped how actions happen, he then categorizes the specific vices that corrupt this internal process. He calls them the love of the world.
What were the main corruptors?
He lists several, and his observations are incredibly sharp. He points to gluttony, noting that overeating actually dulls the intellect and makes the mind sluggish.
The food coma.
Exactly. He warns against an excessive sex drive. He highlights vices of speech, lying, backbiting, gossip. He focuses heavily on self-assertion, which he says manifests as anger, malice, pride, and vanity.
All the ego stuff.
Yes, he condemns the love of wealth and social position, which he knew intimately from his time in Baghdad. And finally, the most insidious vice, hypocrisy and self-deception, where you convince yourself you're being righteous when you're really just feeding your ego.
To counter this massive list of human flaws, he maps out the virtues, the redeeming qualities that actually polish the mirror of the soul. He lists repentance, abstinence, and he notes that abstinence isn't just painfully avoiding bad things. It's actively turning towards something better.
It's a positive motion, not just restriction.
Right. Patience, which he claims reaches its highest form as patience in the midst of suffering. Gratitude. Truthfulness, a balance of fear and hope, and ultimately reliance on God, which is called tawakkul.
We really need to pause and appreciate the deep psychological realism Ghazali applies here. He did not demand the complete eradication of all human instincts.
He wasn't a Puritan.
No, he wasn't telling people to stop being human. He demanded their strict moderation. He understood that trying to kill your instincts entirely would just break your psyche.
He used another great analogy for this, right? The dog at the gate.
Yes. Imagine you were trying to enter a king's grand palace, but a vicious, starving guard dog is blocking the gate.
Okay, I see it.
If you try to fight the dog hand to hand, you will spend hours bleeding and wrestling in the dirt, and you'll never see the king. But if you simply throw the dog a small morsel of meat, the dog is distracted, and you can calmly walk right past it into the palace.
So the dog represents our base biological desires, or even Satan.
Exactly. And the morsel of meat is a moderated, controlled amount of worldly pleasure. You give the physical body exactly what it needs to survive and be quiet, so that the higher soul can walk past the distraction and reach the king, which is God. Moderation, not eradication.
I love the pragmatism of that, but I have to challenge his ethics just a bit here.
Please do.
In the text, he says that absolute single-mindedness is the fruit of a fully trained soul, and he heavily praises asceticism and poverty. In today's hyper-connected, deeply ambitious world where we have mortgages and careers, is this ethical system actually livable? Do I have to give away all my money and live in a cave like he did for 11 years to be considered a good person?
It is a very fair challenge, and it's a tension Ghazali himself wrestled with. In his later writings, he acknowledged that his path of complete physical renunciation was an extreme medicinal response because his specific spiritual disease was a pathological, blinding obsession with fame and status.
So it was just for him.
He needed radical chemotherapy for his soul, basically. But for the everyday person, his concept of poverty and abstinence evolved to mean something closer to internal detachment.
Detachment meaning what, practically?
It means it is not inherently sinful to own wealth. The sin is when the wealth owns you. You can be a millionaire, you can have the nice house. But if your house burns to the ground tomorrow, a soul truly trained in Ghazali's ethics would say it was always just a temporary loan from the Creator anyway, and they would remain internally at peace.
It's about letting go.
The goal is internal detachment from the world, not necessarily external destitution. Because the ultimate final goal of all his ethics is the love of God, which erupts naturally when the polished soul recognizes that God is the sole source of all beauty and all benefits.
This incredible holistic synthesis of penetrating psychology, devastating philosophical critique, and deep theological mysticism left a mark that literally changed the course of history. Let's move into our final discussion. Ghazali's legacy and the ultimate rebuttal he faced.
Ghazali's impact on the Islamic world and eventually the Western world is truly unparalleled. His massive multi-volume masterpiece, the Ihya Ulum al-Din, or the revivification of the religious sciences, was so profoundly influential that some later scholars dared to call it the second Quran.
Wow, that's massive praise.
He accomplished something monumental. He permanently wove the inward mystical practices of Sufism into the fabric of mainstream Orthodox Islamic theology. He made it acceptable, even expected, to be deeply emotionally spiritual and rigorously logical at the exact same time.
He bridged the gap between the head and the heart. But you don't dismantle the entire philosophical establishment without making some serious, highly motivated enemies. It wasn't all applause.
Not at all.
Orthodox clerics in places like Spain and North Africa literally ordered his books to be burned in the public squares because they thought his methods were too heavily infected with the very philosophy he was trying to critique.
He was too mystical for the rigid legalists and too orthodox for the radical mystics. But his greatest, most formidable critic was a philosopher who lived a few generations later in Spain, the brilliant Aristotelian Ibn Rushd, who is known in the Western tradition as Averroes.
And Ibn Rushd did not hold back. He read Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers, and he wrote a massive, incredibly detailed, point-by-point rebuttal. And he titled his rebuttal, tahafut al-tahafut, which translates to the incoherence of the incoherence.
It is arguably the greatest academic diss track in the history of philosophy.
Oh, for sure.
Ibn Rushd was a pure, unyielding rationalist. He accused Ghazali of profound hypocrisy. He argued that Ghazali used the very tools of philosophical logic, the precise terminology, the syllogisms, the categories of Aristotle to destroy philosophy, and that he only did this to win favor with the powerful orthodox theologians of his day.
Calling him a sellout.
Furthermore, Ibn Rushd pointed out numerous apparent contradictions across Ghazali's various books, claiming Ghazali changed his tune depending on who he was talking to.
It's a clash of historical titans. But looking at the whole picture of Ghazali's life that we've discussed today, evaluate that for us. Was Ibn Rushd's critique fair? Was Ghazali actually a hypocrite who contradicted himself?
We have to acknowledge the immense complexity of Ghazali's life and his vast body of work. He was writing for radically different audiences at different times in his life.
The audience matters.
Sometimes he wrote highly esoteric, deeply mystical works intended only for advanced Sufi practitioners. Other times, he wrote exoteric, simplified theological manuals for the general public. If you put those books side by side, yes, you will find apparent inconsistencies in the terminology and the depth of the arguments.
Sure.
But Ibn Rushd's core accusation of hypocrisy completely misses the mark.
Because of the physical breakdown.
Exactly. Ghazali was painfully, brutally sincere. A man who gives away a fortune and loses his ability to speak because of intellectual guilt is not a political opportunist.
You don't fake that.
He didn't hate reason. He hated the arrogance of philosophers who claimed that their limited human reason could neatly solve the infinite mysteries of God and the universe.
And history seems to have rendered a verdict. Even if Ibn Rushd's logic in his rebuttal was brilliant, and scholars agree it was a masterpiece of rational thought, Al-Ghazali's overarching worldview ultimately became vastly more influential.
It absolutely did.
Why is that? Why did Ghazali's synthesis win the hearts and minds of the masses, while Ibn Rushd's pure, unadulterated philosophy kind of faded from prominence in the Islamic world, even though it heavily influenced Christian Europe later on?
I believe it is because Ghazali spoke to the entirety of a human condition. Think about what Ibn Rushd was offering. He offered a God who was a prime mover, an abstract, distant intellect.
Right.
That is intellectually satisfying to a tiny handful of elite scholars, but it is spiritually freezing cold.
It's the battery again.
Ghazali offered something entirely different. He offered a living, willing, intensely personal God who knew the creeping of the black ant in the dark night. Furthermore, he offered a practical, deeply empathetic psychological roadmap for dealing with human frailty, anxiety, and ego.
So it was applicable.
He didn't just tell people what theological propositions to believe. He gave them a step-by-step method to internally experience the truth.
Which brings us full circle to where we started. We opened this deep dive talking about the illusion of worldly certainty, the crisis of achieving everything society tells you to achieve, getting the corner office, the title, the wealth, and then realizing you are completely empty inside.
The modern dilemma.
Ghazali walked away from the absolute pinnacle of 11th century success because he recognized that a brain stuffed full of unexamined, inherited facts does not equal a peaceful soul.
Not at all.
He was willing to dismantle the nature of causality, he challenged the very fabric of time, and he mapped the human mind with a precision that rivals modern clinical psychology, all to cure his own spiritual disease.
He forces every person who reads him to rigorously examine the foundations of their own certainties. Are we believing the things we believe just because of our environment and our upbringing? Are we arrogant enough to confuse the observable habits of nature with the ultimate, transcendent reality of existence?
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, building directly on Ghazali's psychological breakdown of human action.
The 5 steps.
Right, remember his sequence. First the impression, then the inclination, then the conviction, then the resolution, and finally the action. In our modern, hyper-connected age, our minds are bombarded with impressions at a rate and intensity that Ghazali couldn't have even hallucinated.
Oh, the sheer volume is staggering.
Think about your algorithmic social media feeds, the endless doom scrolling, the constant vibrating digital notifications in your pocket. If Ghazali is right that our true free will, our actual human agency, exists only in that tiny, fragile space between the initial biological inclination and the final rational resolution, are we willingly outsourcing our free will to our devices?
It is a chilling question. If an algorithm is perfectly designed to supply the impression, instantly trigger the biological inclination, and completely bypass our rational convictions straight into a click, a purchase, or an action, we are systematically losing our agency. We are becoming the philosopher's passive mechanistic universe.
Exactly. Is the ultimate modern spiritual crisis simply a crisis of hijacked attention? We are so constantly distracted by the noise, so bombarded by impressions, that we can't even find the wall of our soul, let alone take the time to polish it.
That's a profound takeaway.
So as you go about your day today, maybe leave the notifications behind for just a moment. Embrace a little bit of Ghazali's detachment and ponder how you might step out of the noise and polish the mirror of your own mind.